Hi everyone. So today we're going to talk about how I create these pine trees that I'm using for my illustrations for my book. And so this is the tree that we're going to be working on today. I'm going to show you how to draw it first, and then I'll talk about painting and some of the details that we do. So to start with, when I'm working on drawing pine trees, I always start with a series of lines. Usually if I'm creating a stand of trees, I kind of decide on how I'm going to put them together, what sizes they are. Once I get the lines drawn, then I go back and starting at the top, I create the top of my tree, and then I go in just a little bit on that triangle and down and out. And I keep doing that, kind of getting my lines a little bit bigger, my angles a little bit wider as I go down. And then as I get close to the bottom, I can choose if I want to have a tree trunk or if I want to have the tree actually cover the ground. The other type of pine tree that I'm working on right now is similar to the first one, but instead of drawing a straight line across the bottom, I draw a wavy line. And I just keep doing that same thing all the way down. When I'm done, and you'll notice I go behind the tree if I'm doing a series of trees. Okay, when I'm done with my pencil lines, I'll go back with an ink pen, and I use these micron pens. This one's a size 03. And I'll go back over the lines that I want to keep. And usually at this point, if I have a pencil line that I didn't really like, I can kind of rework it and make it a little bit neater than what I might have done with a rough sketch. And I'll do the same for this one. When I'm done with my trees, then I'll go back and I'll erase this pencil line in here before I paint it, or in this case, if I'm cutting it out and adding it to a painting. So I have my tree cut out now, and I've decided that this is where I'd like the tree to go. I'm demonstrating with a tree that I cut out because I had already painted and drawn my other trees for this particular painting. So I thought this would be a good way to do this. So once I decide where I want my tree to go, I have my Mod Podge and my lovely paint brush. These are my brushes that I reserve for handling my glue brush for handling my Mod Podge needs. And so what I do, what I like to do if I have something that I want in a specific place is I keep my thumb down, holding the tree down, or whatever I'm gluing down. I paint the glue underneath it. I set it back down, and then I carefully paint over the top of it too. And that helps to press it down more. And then I lift up the other end, paint underneath that with the glue, and paint over the top of that too. Okay, once the tree is completely dry, and I want to make sure that it's completely dry before I paint on it, I will come back in with various shades of green. And I like to kind of vary the greens for my trees for a little more visual interest. I can come back in and And I'll start adding some nice color to these. And I don't worry about losing my line because at the end I will go back in with an ink pen and add those lines back in. Sometimes I go in with pen to add texture as well. So I'll go in, and I do like to leave some of the brush marks in there because I think it adds some nice texture underneath. So I'll try to leave some of those sometimes. I'll go ahead and fill that in. And I don't worry too much for being a precision painter. When I'm laying the base layer down, I don't worry too much if I go outside of the lines a little bit, because I think it kind of adds a little bit to the painting as well. Okay. So then I'll go back and I'll wait for this to dry. So one reason I do like working on a painting that has a lot of different elements to it, a lot of different things going on, is it gives me the option to work on some other spots of my painting while I'm waiting for certain things to dry. Or if I get tired with the kind of tedious aspects of some of my stuff, such as my mosaic work down there. So I was working on some trees while I was waiting for this other tree to dry. Now we'll go ahead and focus back in on this tree, and my next step will be to go in, and you can kind of see what I've already done over here, and I've shown other videos kind of demonstrating this, but I'm going to go back in and I'm going to add some texture in here. Now there are tons of different ways you can add this texture. I decided to go with a simple line texture for my illustration, just to show some of the needlework in there. But you can also go in, sometimes I've added some little patterns to it, like I'll do a dot, a series of dots and connect them with lines. I might just do some simple lines kind of running horizontally instead of vertically. There's lots of different options that you can do. I can also just run some highlights on the edges if I wanted to do that, or just some lines on the edges. So be creative. You can come up with all sorts of different designs, but the technique is still the same. So I'm using a very small detail brush to do this, and I'm starting at the bottom, and I'm just going to add a series of lines going across. And I'm keeping them fairly short. Then I'm reloading my brush again, and I'm continuing to go across. And I'll just keep doing this until my tree is completely full. Okay, so my tree is completely full now. And now I'm going to let that dry a little bit. And I'm going to go back in with some brown, and I'm going to paint the tree trunk real quick. And I'm going to continue using my precision brush for this just because it's a little small there. And this brown that I'm using, I'm actually using it right out of the tube. It's just burnt sienna, kind of a reddish brown. But you can use any shade of brown that you want. And I'm going in while I have the brown, and I have a couple more tree trunks over here, so I figured I'll go ahead and fill those in as well. Okay, so you can see why I use acrylic paint. I do a lot of layers, and I have to wait for those layers to dry in order to continue working. So the acrylic paint really works well for working with layers and being able to continue on with next steps relatively quickly. So I've waited for this to completely dry, and again I'm testing it, making sure it's not sticky. If it's sticky at all, then I know I still need to let it dry just a little bit longer. So while I was waiting, again, I went ahead and continued adding texture to some of these other trees to continue moving on with my progress on the painting, and not just kind of sitting around waiting. So I'm going to add the same shade of green over the top, and I did add just a little bit of water so that when I paint it over the top, I can still see that underlying texture pretty well in there. So adding that over the top, the white that I painted underneath, and whatever pattern you do underneath, the white really adds a lot to it. It's a nice way of developing texture in your piece of artwork. Kind of can be in a subtle way too, depending on what you're using it for. So I'm adding the green over the top of everything. And when I'm done with that, I'm going to go ahead and paint some of the other trees over there with this same green, and I'm going to let this dry. Okay, so my tree is dry once again. So now I'm going to go back in. I'm using the same green that I had mixed before. And again, going back to the first video I did, if you're looking to mix your green, you'd want to mix some yellow with some blue. Depending on the shade that you're wanting. So I went back in with that same green that I had mixed, and this time I added just a little bit of black. And what I'm gonna do is right underneath where I did the curved line, I'm just gonna start painting, and I'm not gonna go quite to the bottom of the tree, but I'm just gonna paint a little shadow in there. And you might not notice it too much, but you'll start to notice it as I build up and as I go back in with my ink work. And again, I'm keeping the paint kind of thin, not adding a lot of water. Usually all I need to do is just dip my brush in water once, and I usually tap the top of a napkin or something like that to get a little water off, and then I go back. Okay. So I added just the tiniest bit of shadow in there. Okay. Okay, last but not least, when the paint is again dry, I'll go back in and use my pen. And for this one, I'm using a micron pen. It's a 0.5 is the size of the tip. You can use smaller. Usually 0.8s are getting a little bit big. But I'll go back in and I'm gonna add ink over the edges to make it stand out. Okay, last but not least, I'll usually go back in with a thinner ink pen. This is a 0.1. And I'll just make some lines in for the tree trunk. And then I'm done with my tree. So that was our first lesson. For our second lesson, I'll be talking about how I get that, and this is one of my big secrets, but how I get this foggy tree illusion going on here. So we'll talk about my techniques for that. Stay tuned.